Why was there doubts about Nick Sirianni? Well, there's many reasons. One, no one ever heard of him. He had no track record. But his first time meeting the Philadelphia media, it did not go well, as Ann Rappaport chronicles.
A lot of people, including me, watched his press conference and took this coach who most people hadn't really heard of, who, certainly hadn't proven himself as like the top coordinator. And we're like, does Philly know what it's doing? What they found, what we didn't know, was an elite leader. Take all the things you want, play calling and whatever, like an elite leader of men. And that is really what he is. He has proven that. They are the champs, and he is very richly rewarded.
Well, and the big thing, he said this is an elite leader of men. And this is one of the things that we talk about with coaches all the time, whether it be baseball, basketball. It's not an X and O thing as the coach anymore. It is, can you keep the locker room together and have trust in your other coaches to be the X and O guys? And that is what the Eagles have been able to kind of foster here as we bring in Geoff Mosher for today's Football at 4 on a Day. The Eagles have signed Nick Sirianni to a multi-year extension, Mosher. I got to imagine you've been doing this a long time. You've covered the Eagles through many incarnations. You covered this team back in the Andy Reid era and all the way through it up to where we are now. This is probably the most improbable hire, success, and result of all of them. And they've had a bunch. Andy came out of nowhere, has become maybe the greatest coach in the history of the game. Nobody wanted to hire Doug Peterson. Philadelphia was the only team that had interest in him. But Nick might be more improbable than those two.
Let's look at it in retrospect. Andy Reid was a quarterbacks coach who was on nobody's radar. Nick Sirianni was an offensive coordinator on nobody's radar. I typically would say if you're a quarterbacks coach on nobody's radar, you're probably more improbable, especially when you become, three-time Super Bowl champion and considered one of the greatest head coaches in the sports history. So, I think we look at it now, it's like, it's Andy Reid. He's great. He's smart. But back then, nobody saw that coming either as well. So it's a nice little tie between Andy Reid and Nick Sirianni, between most improbable or unforeseen success story, but it ties into your point that two of the three come from Jeffrey Lurie, right?
Yeah, but I would say, yes, I think Reid is improbable, but he left here before he gained the highest mountain. Sirianni not only did it here, he did it within 4 years of getting here.
That's a fair part of the story and you're right. Andy built the team up really quickly. They were in 2000, they were right there, right? 2000 to 2004, and that was years 2, 3, 4, 5, but he didn't make it, you're right, over the mountaintop. Now, then you get into the argument, did Andy do more with less than Nick Sirianni in those years of getting to the NFC Championship game? I would argue maybe. I think that's a fair argument.
I don't know.
Nick Sirianni, who was given a lot.
Maybe Sirianni's first team of getting that team to the playoffs might be the most impressive, the least talented team of all of them to get them to the playoffs. Now, he didn't get them as far as maybe Reid took some lesser teams.
All right, so I love this. This is a great conversation, right? Because I'm about to throw one right back at you. If this were 1999, he wouldn't have made the playoffs that year because he got the 7th seed, which was only about 2 years old, or maybe even that was the first year of it, I think. So we wouldn't be calling him a playoff coach that year if it were just even a few years earlier. But he did do a good job of getting a team with not that much. They were still, let's be fair, though, not much playmaking talent, but they were still very, very strong on the offensive and defensive lines.
Yeah, I know. Listen, Sirianni to me is one of the more improbable guys. Peterson had been a player in the league. He was on Andy's staff. Not that he had he wasn't a hot candidate, though. He wasn't like, hey, he's the hot offensive coordinator. I think we all know that Doug got the bump from Andy, and that's why he landed in Philly. He wasn't getting another job unless Andy kind of said, hey, take this guy, he's ready, and he had been the quarterback here, so they had a relationship with him, they knew him. Sirianni came out of nowhere. He had no ties to the organization at all other than the fact that he was on Frank Reich's staff.
Yeah, I remember when the report came out that he was going to be interviewed. It was like, who? You know, a lot of people didn't even realize he was the offensive coordinator of the Colts because Frank Reich was the play caller. And then as the process went on, we started to hear that it was down to him and Josh McDaniels. There were a lot of reasons why Josh McDaniels would have made no sense as an Eagles head coach, but because he was somebody you've heard of and had some cachet, you wondered, could Nick Sirianni really beat out a guy who has had the resume that Josh McDaniels had? And thankfully he did, because I don't think it would have worked well out. I don't think it would have worked that well at all for Josh McDaniels in Philadelphia.
What do you think, Moshe? And, you know, Sirianni's taken a lot of criticism. There are people that don't give him a lot of credit for this team's success. Where do you kind of place him in the pantheon of the success of this team?
Well, that's a good question, Mike. And I think, and by the way, a big shout out to AJ. I know he's listening to our show, AJ. I would say this. I think Doug Peterson's career has cast some doubt, right, on what Nick Sirianni really is, because Doug Peterson looked like after 2 years, holy cow, you have an amazing head coach, an aggressive head coach, a guy who teams will never quit on and will run through the wall for. And then each year afterward got worse and worse. And then the Jacksonville career didn't exactly go great either. It looked good for about a half a cup of coffee there for year one. And then there was an epic tailspin, and then it didn't get much better. And then this past year, he's fired. So it almost makes it look like to me that Doug Peterson was the recipient of a very good 53 from Howie Roseman, and that's why he won. And then when they had injuries and when you couldn't re-sign some guys after 2017, then his coaching, quote unquote, didn't get as good. And we all know that for the last 2 or 3 years, the Eagles have had quite a good 53-man roster. So I think that works against Nick, and seeing Doug's lack of ability to kind of prove himself as a head coach after the great 53-man roster he had probably feeds into that.
Yeah.
But he's a great – and listen, you have to give him credit for doing what he does well, right? Now, you have to give him credit for connecting with the players. You have to give him credit for holding it together. And most importantly, I think you have to give him credit for when the team went through a real nosedive at the end of 2023 and there were questions about his job and whether the team had tuned him out or his actual coaching acumen. He, took on that CEO role even more, hired a guy to call the plays who was not from his own tree in Josh McDaniels, and he became that CEO head coach, and they won a Super Bowl. So I think you have to give him credit for that.
Yeah, well, listen, I think Sirianni does not nearly get the credit to deserve, and I think a lot of times because it's kind of something you hinted at. When fans think of the coach, they want this, like, offensive-minded genius or this defensive-minded genius, and that if they're not the guy that calls the plays, then the question that was asked last year for Nick, well, what do you do? That is where I think Sirianni just didn't get the credit, is people just said, I don't know what this guy does, and that was selling him short.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think that's what feeds into it. I agree with you. You try to look at other CEO head coaches, and I kind of wish I could go back and read, like, what did they say about John Harbaugh after his Super Bowl with the Ravens? I feel like he always has gotten credit for being a good head coach, CEO. Same with Pete Carroll. I think Pete Carroll got more credit because that Seattle team was a bunch of guys who were not, other than Earl Thomas, you had a bunch of guys who were really good on that team that weren't first-round picks, weren't all Pro Bowlers. He kind of it seemed like he kind of made those teams.
And the interesting part, real quick, about Sirianni that I think we also have to point out, he has won with different incarnations of this team, right? He had the first year with Hurts that had nothing, no receivers, nothing, so they ran the ball. He got to the Super Bowl, and they lost that Super Bowl, but with almost an entirely different team that he got back to another Super Bowl with. So he has had multiple incarnations of this roster and has found different ways to win with all the different incarnations.
Yeah, I mean, defensively, I think the Super Bowl, the one they won, is different. Offensively, it's kind of the same team, right? I mean, other than the slot receiver, it's basically,
and the running back's pretty important. He's different. He's different.
But that also sort of works against him then. It's sort of like, well, you got Saquon Barkley. It wasn't like you took some, eighth.
Well, I will say in his defense, though, he got Saquon Barkley, yes. But he also has A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. He could have very easily said, There's been so many rumors that Jeffrey Lurie wants them to throw the ball. They want to be a passing team, and he resists that and says, no, we got this guy. We're going to run the ball for 2,000 yards. Passing be damned.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's fair. I do think this, and we hope that it obviously doesn't manifest this way, but if there's ever a situation where they get hit with a bunch of injuries or the talent just isn't like what it was last year and he doesn't do a good job, there's going to be questions about how good he really is. And I think that would be for any head coach. But the one thing we know is the owner is a little bit of impulsive in that regard. So, if they have a terrible year because they get everybody injured, they go 5-12. Most head coaches who have been Super Bowl champions and made 2 trips are pretty much golden. You'll always wonder about what Jeffrey Lurie is thinking about Nick Sirianni in that regard.
What do you think the relationship is between Sirianni and Roseman? Because that obviously plays a factor here, too, where it's hard if you're the head coach and, the GM is almost perceived to be the rock star of the team over you.
It's a good question. Almost every time there's been a head coach with the Eagles in the Howie Roseman era, and there's really only been, Andy, who was really in charge of personnel, then Chip, and we know Howie and Chip obviously didn't get along. And then was Doug. And I had never heard there was friction between them. I think that, one thing Jeffrey and Howie wanted out of Doug was just a little bit more of a vision, right? And a little bit better of an understanding of the league and being able to replace coaches with other coaches. And that was really never Doug's strong point. But I have not heard of any. I'm sure these guys have their little, I don't want to say tips, but I'm sure that they don't agree on every single thing. But I think Nick recognizes the great situation that he has with the Eagles and with Howie being one of the best GMs, if not the best GM in the league and the 53. So that probably helps him put aside some things he might want to argue on. And same thing with Howie. Having a guy like Nick who knows the league, who has contacts, who's coached with several coaches, and who connects well with a lot of different players. They're obviously working together right now to try to convince the rest of the NFL not to go vote against the tush push. So they're working in tandem on that. So it looks to me like a pretty healthy working relationship.
Yeah, I think that's by the way, the terms on Sirianni are not released, right? They do not tell
They've never done. For head coaches, they've almost never done that.
Yeah, I would imagine. Now, he was one of the lowest paid coaches reportedly. I would have to. That was the big conundrum here is, what do you do with him? How important is he? And how much do they want to pay a coach? We don't know what they're paying Sirianni, but there are reports that he is now among, but there has been no official terms of the deal that I'm aware of. Have you seen any?
No, and I feel like the Ben Johnson thing got a lot of teams mad because, the Bears paid him like $65 million over 5 years. What is that? That's like $13 million a year or something like that, I think, Mike, which is like unheard of for an NFL head coach, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm curious to find out, and I will try to find out. I'm sure Adam will too, if Nick Sirianni is getting more than that, close to that, a little under that.
Yeah, I have not seen any terms of the deal that just says that he is expected to be in the range of Ben Johnson.
Yeah, well, let's just say if he was making more money than Ben Johnson because of this extension, probably would be out there by now, because I'm sure whoever represents him would be like pushing that thing out as, like, we got the number one guy.
But how are you right? If you're the Super Bowl champion, though, I mean, you almost have to say, how do I get paid less than him? He's never been a head coach before in his life, and I just won the Super Bowl.
It's a great question, and those of us, I'm sure if you talk to some other Adam or other reporters, this deal we thought was going to be done quite a while ago, and even Jeffrey Lurie alluded to it at the owners' meetings that it was close, and it has taken some time. So I do wonder if finding that right, realistic price tag between what he should get and what Ben Johnson got, which is again made the whole league kind of, all the owners probably had their eyes pop out of their head.
Right, like if you're the Eagles, if you're the Eagles, were you like, hey, we got to get something done with Nick? We'll do like somewhere in the $8 million range, and then Ben Johnson gets that deal, and you're like, are you kidding me? Like,
yeah,
that probably could have delayed a lot of this because now he resets the market at $13 million. If you're Nick Sirianni, his agent, you got to say, listen, you got to pay my guy more than Ben Johnson.
I mean, every agent who represents a coach who has any kind of success is going to be doing that. I think Mike Tomlin makes, I don't know, either $12.5 million, maybe more too. I mean, and this guy's been in the playoffs also every year. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I'm sure Nick Sirianni got quite the bump.
All right, real quick, the other news today, which was going to have a little bit more conversation until this news came down, which is the last time they won a Super Bowl, and I remember this vividly, because at that time, Howie was not the Howie that he is now. There were a lot of people who were not Howie fans. And I remember a lot of my text messages and callers at the time saying, well, the Eagles won the Super Bowl, but it wasn't Howie. It was Joe Douglas who was behind a lot of the players that they found to build that 2017 Super Bowl team. Douglas got hired. He was the GM with the Jets. He has done a good job drafting with the Jets, by the way, but he was fired. He is now back. What kind of impact did Joe Douglas have before?
Well, he was, at the time that he was hired, if you recall, the power had just come back to Howie Roseman, right? And Jeffrey Lurie mandated that Howie hire somebody with some chops. He wasn't just going to give everything back to Howie after the Chip Kelly disaster and say, you're the guy, you get everything. So he was asked to hire a guy to lead the scouting staff and personnel department, not just lead it, but, bring in his people and set the board. And that's what Joe Douglas did. So he did bring in not only a lot of the players through the draft and through personnel, but Mike, he brought in a lot of staff and scouts who rose through the ranks pretty high and are now assistant GMs with other teams. And that's Andy Weidel with the Steelers and Ian Cunningham with the Bears. Those are guys that he knew from his Ravens days, Joe Douglas, and brought him in. So he had a very big impact on the organization, not only from on-field personnel and drafting and players, but scouting as well in front office.
A lot of people back then, man. I remember the people calling in left and right. This wasn't Howie. This was Joe Douglas. Well, now Howie has his right-hand man from 2016 to 2019 back in Philadelphia. I would imagine help find more talent now. There's a lot of talent on this roster, but now you got Joe Douglas back with the Philadelphia Eagles. But the big story today, Nick Sirianni gets a multi-year extension to remain the head coach of the Philadelphia Eagles. And it's amazing because I don't know, this one kind of is in a weird spot. You had Mick Abel have a big day. Alvarado gets banged with that. And then your head coach of the football team getting a multi-year extension almost feels like it just kind of fell somewhere below all of the stuff that is going on for a guy who just won the Super Bowl.
Yeah, I know. Well, so real quick, I remember when I was at Comcast, CSN, and reporting, TV writing, I got to see like all the stories on a board, like how they were doing and what the views were. And one day, I think, didn't Cole Hamels pitch a no-hitter like right before he got traded?
It was his last start before he got traded.
Yeah, so on that day, I broke a very, very small story about the Eagles taking back the RFA tender on Chris Polk. Who they had put the tender
the running
on
back from the University of Washington.
Yes, yeah, and they decided to renege it. He asked for them to take it back, so they did finally, and he was going to become a free agent. And that story I wrote on Chris Polk was actually the number one story over the Hamels no-hitter, just to tell you how obsessed we are with Eagles content here in the Delaware Valley. So that was kind of funny.
Geoff Mosher, Philly voice, and, of course, Inside the Birds, the Inside the Birds podcast you can get on all podcasting platforms, and, of course, right here on Football at 4 on the Sports Bash Live on 97.3 ESPN. All right, Moshe, thanks, buddy.
All right, reader questions again. We'll do that on Wednesday, maybe? I enjoyed those.
We could definitely re-get the reader questions and try to get some more of that cultivated here. I figure that we'll be using some mailbag stuff through the offseason here, but some big news today with Sirianni. But, yes, if we have stuff, we will certainly put that out there for our listeners to get the Mosher mailbag going here on these Mosher Mondays and Wednesdays here on Football at 4. All right, man.
Take care. That's right. Listener questions. I don't know why I said reader. I'm caught in the website mindset. But yeah, listener questions. I always love them. Take care.
You got it, man. All right, there's Mosher here on a Football at 4 Monday here on the Sports Bash. Tomorrow, Adam Kaplan is here for Football at 4 on the Sports Bash Live on 97.3 ESPN.